1. Good afternoon and welcome to the HHREC's Mental Health Podcast. Today's guests will be KCCEB, and that acronym stands for the Korean, I always forget the name.
Korean Community Center of the East Bay.
Thank you.
It's a long
The Korean
acronym.
Community Center of the East Bay.
It's a long acronym.
It is.
I appreciate you guys' help. With KCCEB being here, their mission is kind of their mission is to empower immigrants in the Bay Area through access to education, services, resources, and advocacy. They are a bridge to helping individuals get needed resources at critical moments in their lives. Now, I have here Yuri and Pise from KCCEB. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having us, by the way. So my name is Pise Finith. I am a licensed clinical social worker and a program director at Korean Community Center of the East Bay.
And as same as well, thank you for having us. My name is Yeri Sean with Korean Community Center of the East Bay. I am Chief of Program Integration and Community Impact.
Awesome. Now, please tell me, really, I want to know your stories and how you got involved into this such passionate work.
Ooh, that's a long story.
Definitely a long story.
I could start first. And so it really starts from coming from immigrant family. So my parents, my family immigrated here when I was 8. And my parents really decided to come here because they wanted a better future for me and my sister. So it was that simple hope that they decided to uproot everything and just leave everything they were familiar with. And as we came here, it was just interesting growing up because my parents said it was a better, this country had better future for us. But I realized there was so much health inequity and disparity. So as I was growing up, I became more and more gradually, I would say, passionate/angry about health inequity and how to fight it. And it was just there were some couple more personal things that happened in our family. And then also as I started working, I started seeing it a little bit more in systemic view. So with my father, he was diagnosed with deep vein thrombosis, and it's because he worked on his feet all day, 362 days, because literally my parents got 3 days off work per year, and the rest of the times they worked like 16 hours a day. It took about 2 years to get that diagnosis that he needed, and because a lot of it was language access. So he had, our parents are still limited English proficient. And they just couldn't find a provider that spoke the language. It was really hard to find healthcare system that was able to accommodate all of these barriers. So there was that. And then later on, I was actually diagnosed with a chronic illness, and I really needed consistent care. And the care here is very expensive to even upkeep. So the rest of my family actually had to give up their healthcare just so that I could get access to healthcare. And I think all of those experiences made me wonder, why is it so hard to get that very basic human right? In Korea, it's a universal single-payer system. So to think that we came here for better opportunity, but here we can't even go see a doctor when we're sick, which was such an easy thing to do when we were back in Korea. I think that really got me started thinking about this line of work. And for a while, I was a pre-med. But I think after working, I realized that it was a systemic issue more than anything. So it naturally led me to what can I do around that field? And part of it is, my parents really wanted me to be a doctor, of course, right? All Asian immigrant parents want your daughter to be lawyers, doctors. But it was really thinking about my role as 1.5 generation, seeing all these communities. It was so interesting because you see second gen, 1.5 gen succeed, right? Parents come here, make the sacrifice, kids really thrive. They go off doing these great things. And then the community is left behind. No one is here to take care of those seniors or those parents that supported them or those rest of the community that are still left behind. And I was like, why is that, right? There is such a huge gap. So I wanted to be that person who didn't move on and just say, I'm doing great things, see you later, mom and dad. But I wanted to be still in the community trying to help our older generation, our newly arriving immigrants actually get to a place where they could thrive as well. So that's where I'm at.
sharing.
Yeah.
Well, as yet as an immigrant, my experience is actually coming to the U.S. as a refugee. So my family and I, like a lot of many other Cambodian, or we call it Khmer, communities, are survivor of the Khmer Rouge auto genocide. So both my parents were survivor of the labor camp, and we fled Cambodia during the time when the Khmer Rouge regime got dismantled. But before that, they had to live through that 4 years of horror. So my parents and my mother, sorry, my dad and my mom, when they were living in the labor camp, a lot of many family members as well, they were living in the most horrendous environment. You have famine, you have execution, you have children, parents, and grandparents separated from different labor camps. Just because, if any of you don't know what the Khmer Rouge regime is, during Cambodia in 1974, there was a new regime that came in after the Vietnam War, and they basically took over Cambodia, and they wanted to start an era what they called Day Zero. So what they did was they kicked out all the West influence. They basically killed artists, teachers, faith leaders, or religious leaders, and they separated the children and the families in different camps, and to basically be able to work the land. And my parents and my older brother were part of that during that era. And what was tough, I think they survived the horror, but they brought the horror here to the U.S. to a certain extent, which was just a lot of trauma. And they survived, execution as well, because during that time when my parents were there, my family were marked for execution. One of the reasons is just because my dad was fluent in 3 or 4 languages. He was fluent in Lao, Thai, and then, of course, Khmer. And during that time, there was so many suspicion. If there's suspicion that if you're fluent in many languages, you may be a spy or a political spy or something like that. And because my dad was fluent in that, my whole family were marked for execution. And the way the Khmer Rouge regime do it is that the way they view it is that you have to basically destroy the family from the roots. So everyone are marked for execution for the whole family as a way of protecting their regime. So what happened was that my dad found out about it. He and my mom and my brother, they split up. They fled apart. My dad fled to Thailand, and he was imprisoned in Thailand during the regime for about a year or so. And then my mom fled to another labor camp. When you flee from one labor camp to another, you are actually deemed a traitor. And if you are deemed a traitor, you will be executed there. However, when my mom fled to the other labor camp, she fled to where my grandparents were living. And my grandparents literally pleaded to the leader there at the labor camp to basically not execute my mom and my brother for fleeing from another labor camp. So that's how they survived, and they were able to stay with my grandparents. And, these are the stories that were shared with me by my uncles and family members, just surviving the journey to the U.S. And I'm sorry, just reliving it is just really, really, really tough.
You're sharing your story. You're being vulnerable. I
Yeah.
appreciate you. I appreciate your story. And
So,
I want to hear what you have to say.
so when the Khmer Rouge, so just a little bit about the Khmer Rouge is that during that era, within that 4-year alone, a third of the Khmer population literally died, whether, like you said, by famine, forced labor, execution. And it's crazy how, the Khmer Rouge literally destroyed the best of our society because they wanted to start something what they call as a utopia. Their definition of utopia is like a blank slate. If it means pretty much, separating families and children together, they want to literally divide everything and separate everything from, not calling your parents mother and father, but the leader, or they call it the uncle or the angka, which is the organization. Forced marriages was happening during that time. And, my parents and my brother had to live through all of that. And I was born right after the Khmer Rouge regime fell. But we live near the border, where they were still there and they were pillaging our village, and our communities were never feeling safe. And so, my dad wanted to leave. He's like, we can't live like this. That's the reality. And during that time, my mom didn't want it to leave. My mom wanted to stay with my grandparents. And my dad said that, you can stay, but I'm taking my son, like you wanted to take my brother only, with me. And my mom was forced to make a decision, stay and separate her family, or leave, and then come to the U.S. So that was, or leave just basically just to the refugee camps. What I remember, my experience was actually experiencing the journey of crossing the border. I was about, I think, 4 at the time. And I remember we were driving in the middle of the night, and we lost already our paper because this was after the regime fell. So we had to go through by coyote. We had to sneak into the Thai border. And I remember it was dark, and it was like almost like dawnish. And we were in a truck. We got out of the truck. I remember my dad handing, I think, a swat of like envelope to maybe a coyote. And I remember my dad actually putting me on his back, and then tightening the krama, which is the towel that tightened to carry me. And I remember my dad telling me, "It's like, whatever you do, don't look back." And I didn't understand that at the time. All I remember was holding to him, and all I remember is that finally just us running. And I was one of the many family members that ran across the Thai refugee camp to at least the border. And the crazy part that I remember is just hearing bullets and looking behind me, just seeing sparks of fire. And you hold a pow, 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 and you see the spark of fire. And the crazy part is, as we're running across the border, we have Khmer soldiers or the Khmer Rouge, I don't know who, was shooting at us. As we're running towards the borders, the Thai border, we have the Thai soldiers shooting at us. So you have like both countries basically not wanting us to leave and not wanting us to seek refuge. And that was my journey, to the U.S. And we lived at the Thai refugee camp for about 4 or 5 years. And then, facing a lot of different other challenges and horrors and just trying to make it to the U.S. That was our journey. And when we came to the U.S., we thought that we were leaving, similar to what Yeri is like, to come to a better world, to a better country, because that's what my parents fought for. They survived just to make it here. But we realized that many Cambodians who came here as refugees, we actually got relocated to not the best places, right? Many of us were relocated to like very isolated rural area where they didn't have enough resources. Others were relocated to a lot of urban areas where it was ridden with community violence, school violence, gang violence. And, that's what I grew up with. So when we came to the U.S., it was definitely a struggle because we live in the communities where we had to survive that. My siblings and I, and a lot of my communities, we're faced with that to a certain extent. And so I myself consider myself a 1.5 Gen 2. And because we speak English and my parents were so involved in the community, I sort of became what we call the little social worker in the community. I was the translator. We read all the, anything that's in English. Our parents is like, well, you know English, so you have to help us, right? And so I grew up basically, translating at the age of like, I think 11 or 12, 13, going to social services and being an interpreter, with going to like receiving, those who are applying for benefits, going to the doctor appointments and so on, becoming a medical interpreter, and even going to court, even at that age, to provide interpretation. I didn't understand it at the time. I just, I was doing what I needed to do for my community because my parents asked me to. And my parents were so involved in the community because they saw like a lot of our community members didn't have the resources that they need. And all I knew that I wanted was to help. I think what was a telling point for me to go into the mental health field was really two periods in my life. One was my experience with my dad. When I was in the community and supporting my community, it was always been other families, just helping other family members with interpretation and helping fill out forms and understanding and redirecting and navigating, and supporting them. But what stood out to me today is when I had to go and interpret for my dad with his psychiatrist to get help, but also to get medication. And that was the first time that my dad has shared his experience of being a survivor of the Khmer Rouge regime. And as I'm sitting there and interpreting, his experience of being tortured, his experience of being tied up in a tree and being beaten almost to death, his experience of hearing that his family was going to be executed and having to leave everything, including his family, to survive, and separating and not knowing whether his wife or his children are going to survive or even alive. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to this horror for the first time in my life, that my dad survived all of that. And then also, for the first time, to actually see my father, who has always been the leader in the community, who has always been the strong man, who has always carried the weight and the responsibility, not only for his family, but for his community, cried for the first time. Imagine a 12-year-old hearing this horror and then seeing your father literally break down in front of you. It is like, I don't even know how to even respond. I was shocked. I was like, I couldn't even all I remember was that I couldn't even I wanted to hold him. I wanted to touch him, but I was so shocked. I didn't know what to do but just stare at him.
It was like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was just like it was an out of plane existence.
It was.
You were just talking.
It was, yeah.
I wasn't just narrating, communicating, but in the back, you're like,
I mean, if you want to talk
whoa.
about trauma, that's what trauma immediately looks like to you as a child.
Yeah.
Right? You talk about PTSD, you talk about these kind of things. If you talk about vicarious trauma, this is it. Right? Intergenerational trauma, this is it. So, and I remember feeling so helpless, but similar to what Yeti experienced, so angry. I'm like, why am I here? I am a child. I should not be here with my father being an interpreter. What is wrong with this society? What is wrong with this country? So that was one of my journey of even just plainly knowing that I need to do something, right? Nobody's here in this country is helping my father. And you have this man speaking in English and, being completely detached and distant and maybe not even understanding what is going on with my father. And then you have his child for the first time hearing these stories. And he has to deal with that, And then the other part was when I had to interpret for one another Khmer elders in the community at the hospital. You can tell, I didn't know at the time, but now as a clinician looking back, you can tell she was she was completely experiencing major depressive disorder. She had the SADA effect. She was completely sort of disconnected. She was sort of zoned out. But while we were waiting, and like I said, when we talk about support, right, social service support, while you're waiting and sitting there waiting for the doctor, and that was me, she started sharing about her Khmer refugees experience, shared her journey. And she was also a survivor as well. She survived the labor camp, prior to coming to the U.S. And she shares the story of how she lost one of her, she had a miscarriage back in the refugee camps. And in her mind, when she shared it, you can tell there was a part of her still grieving about that. But as she was sharing it, she was sharing how when she lost her child, she sat there and she remembered, she said, and then after that, I just keep seeing my baby crying and crawling on the floor. And it's and when I look, I keep seeing more of my babies on the floor everywhere. And I try to hold, grab my baby. I just can't seem to grab my baby. And then I realizes that during that time, her grief was actually forcing her to start having hallucination about her baby. And that was my first exposure to psychosis to a certain extent. At a tender age of 12, 13, it's just mind-boggling to a certain extent.
But hearing that, hearing that as a 12-year-old, it's like, well, wait a minute, why are you seeing things? Are you seeing ghosts? Are you seeing...
Exactly. I didn't understand it.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong there. And it's really up to you as not only as a survivor, but also as a community member, as you explained, you were a very avid community member in the Korean community or the Cambodian community.
Mm-hmm.
It's very heartwarming to hear that, you found found what you wanted to do through not only the pain, but also the lived-in experience that you have. Because I don't think a lot of individuals understand when you put someone who has lived-in experience in the position to help others get out of that same experience, you will find that the work will more than likely get done, but it will get done in a very effective manner because you have been through that. And I just want to appreciate your story again.
Thank you.
I want to appreciate you again coming on today. And just, I know you said you had to relive that, and I can't imagine what that's like. I've never gone through situations like that, but I have gone through situations to where if I talk about it, if it comes out, yes, I will begin to well up. I'll begin to cry. So I have similar experiences there. But again, I do appreciate you for coming on.
Yeah. But I do have to say, my experience, it does give me the privilege, like you said, to understand and serve my community, whether it's the Cambodian community, whether it's other immigrant community, is that the journey, there's similarity in those journeys, the hardship, the passion, desire, how parents have to sacrifice everything to bring their children or their family here because they hope for a better life in the U.S., right? So living that American dream. But sometimes not everyone lives that American dream. It's almost like living in the American nightmare before they even reach that American dream. And many refugees have experienced that. So, when they talk about, why am I so passionate about my work and so on, I feel as though I didn't search for this work, right? I feel like this work has found me because my experience has sort of moved me and pushed me, because growing up, in our community, especially whether it's our immigrant or refugees community, disparity is so huge. Lack of resources is ridiculous. Language access, something that should have been just easily understood, because knowing that we are a diverse society, not everyone is going to be fluent in English, but in order to lift everyone together, you got to give those resources to everyone to be successful. So, and that's kind of what drove me into the mental health field, my own live experience, but seeing how my community have struggled with resources and lack of mental health resources, or even just lack of health access and so on. And living in very, kind of almost inhumane environment. I mean, I grew up living in a poor community where drive-by shooting is as common as eating candies, right? One of my sister's classmates, who when we were in middle school, her, she died of a drive-by shooting. That was our next door neighbor, and that's where, when we think about how we were displaced from one country by the product of a war that we were not responsible for, and yet we are displaced to another country where we live in an environment where it's an ongoing war every day, right? When we talk about war and poverty, war and substance, just trying to make ends meet every day in our community while trying to heal from trauma, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. And yet, how do we heal when we don't even have a place to even rest and breathe?
I feel like, you say, just listening to you, I mean, I've heard bits and pieces of the story before too, but in a way, I think as 1.5 generation, our role is to stay angry and passionate, but also to stir up that feeling of it's not okay that our system is treating our communities this way. We have to do something, because I think our older generations used to living with that. It's okay. They're okay with enduring it. They're okay with just coping with it in their own way. It is what it is, but at least we're getting by, or at least, we're alive. At least we're this and this. So it's okay. For my parents, a lot of it is well, at least you guys grew up and we were able to raise you. And it's not okay in a way. It's not okay that they have to live in this broken system, constantly still consistently facing barriers. And I think it's people like us, our role to say, no, it's not okay. And you should have a feeling of that almost I always tell our clients, don't even think about being confident, but almost feeling entitled. No, I am entitled to get translation services when I go to these places. I am entitled to request for this XYZ support or accommodations. And how we kind of, support our community to get there. I think that's going to be a constant work in progress.
And I completely agree with you. I'm on the flip side. I'm part of the Latin community, right? But I don't speak Spanish. When my grandma speaks to me, she talks to me in English, right? But it's broken English, and she had to accept that. She had to accept the fact that no one was going to help her, no one was going to see her No one was gonna give her the resources she needs. She had to endure alcoholism and not drug abuse, but alcoholism and sort of trying to maneuver as a single mother, raising my mom and her sister and her brother. And it boggled my mind by how inhumane our multi-ethnic groups were treated back in the 60s, the 70s, right?
Exactly.
We talk about racism. We talk about how there was, the African American movement with Dr. King, but it's not just that. There were many different disparities in other different communities. And for you to share that community and what happened during that time, you're basically putting that on the map now. Like, okay, when people watch this podcast, they're going to see, okay, it wasn't just that was happening. It was multiple generational traumas that were going on during that time. And I resonate and I agree. It's our job. I don't know if I'm a 1.5 or a 1.0 or a 2.0, but what I do know
might be 1.5.
What I do know is that, yes, it's my job to be angry. It's my job to be like, yes, you're entitled to this. Not only did you grow up in this country and you weren't afforded the opportunities that I'm afforded, but on top of that, your mental health, your physical health, and your life matters, regardless of who you are.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
All right. So the next question is, how did you guys find out about KCCEB? Like, where did that stem from?
I'd like to go first.
I feel like Yeri needs to start first because she's like has been there from, I feel like, for a while.
It might be a long story. Maybe that's why I usually.
I'll start first then. My story is very short. So, how I found out about KCCB is it's interesting because I learned about KCCB in 2010. That's when I actually completed my MSW, Master in Social Welfare program, and then started my job at Asian Community Mental Health Services. And I was there to actually, we call it ACMHS, to actually run a Mental Health Services Act program called the Prevention Early Intervention. And in that program, we actually partner with a lot of our Asian Pacific Islanders partner, and KCCB happens to be one of them. And I learned to KCCB because we actually attended their first gala. So that was really amazing. And June Lee, who's our current executive director, she started during the first gala because she hosted the gala. So that's how I learned about KCCEB. And throughout the years, we partner, with just providing, first we actually partnered providing counseling support to Korean survivor of domestic violence. So when there's needs, we actually would go to their KCCB and be able to provide support for that. And then in like 2012 or 2014, we did a collaboration with the Cover California in Contra Costa County to help basically enroll a lot of our API community members in Contra Costa County into Cover California. And that's when we were able to host like a Cover California wellness fair. And we were able to, with support of KCCB, hosted the event, but we're able to bring in like 17 different API languages, which was huge, especially in Contra Costa County, because language access is even much more challenging than in Alameda County. And, Contra Costa County is not as robust, but by doing that, we then actually came together and formed, like, I think our first API advocacy group in Contra Costa County to really advocate for mental health as well as wellness needs, as well as social service need through language access. So that's how I learned about KCCB. And then in 2018, KCCB received a grant, the Prevention Early Intervention grant from the county. And during that time, I was interested in getting back into community work because I kind of left mental health community work for a period to actually become an organizer for about 2 years to organize mental health workers, for a union for a period of time. And then I decided that I miss working with my community. And then I reached out, and KCCB recruited me for that position to be able to just really start our Asian community wellness program. And we are 4 years strong. 4 years strong, which is amazing. So yeah, and then after that, we actually Judy graduated, and we brought her back into KCCEB.
Once you're part of KCCEB,
Like-
you never leave.
Yeah.
It's like you were a baby,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden, oh, you're done with school. Guess
Exactly.
what? Come right back.
And it's so funny because we used to we were a different organization. We had another colleague who was at community health
For Asian American.
for Asian American, and then ACMHS, and then KCCEB. We've always partnered, but we've never fully worked together. And this is the first time we actually all came together, became
Trifecta.
a trifecta at KCCEB.
Yuri was born.
And Yuri was born. Yes, she bloomed. We all bloom together now.
I wish I was that young, but no. So with my work, I guess it is around 2010. Actually, it starts our journey started similarly. I was working at a federally qualified health center back then, working with youth, actually, for a youth program, focusing on reproductive health equity. So, by the way, I love working with teens. A lot of people tell me that, like, oh, that's kind of like, don't you want to work with kids? I'm like, no, I love teens. They're always fun to work with. But I think I was starting to think about, this is also that time when I realized, like, okay, going from pre-med to like, what is that I can do in systematic level? Maybe, becoming a physician who I have immense respect for, of course, but maybe that's just not my path. So I wanted to do something. One was like, is there a place where I could actually utilize my language skill, where my Korean bilingual skill is needed, where I could still help my community members in the native language. And then two was like, where can I sort of switch that gear to looking at things at more like systemic level, or looking at like socioeconomic factors. And then around that time, healthcare reform happened, right? Affordable Care Act was passed, and healthcare reform, funny enough, is something that I followed since I was high school, like in the 90s.
Wow.
Like 90s,
Wow.
like Clinton days, like when, during Clinton's era, when they were trying to pass universal healthcare or trying to do this, like I was thinking like, finally US is doing something about healthcare access. And then it, didn't happen. And then the rest is history. But so when Affordable Care Act passed, I was like, wow, I'm actually witnessing something historical. And what are some things that I can contribute to? And at the time, like as soon as I joined KCCB, it was already a switch happening from revamping our social services program, which is our legacy program, into community health access, because health access was such a big issue in the community. So it was such a like great timing to say, like, as I was joining, organization was going through that like transition to focus on health access. And with the policy change happening, we were sort of able to come together and say, well, what can we do as an organization to do something about this? Something's changing at a policy level. But as we also know that I think there's policymakers that have really great intentions making those changes at top, but also without realizing how things can get implemented or what things can get lost in the middle of that, from the top to bottom to actual ground level implementation. So I think we saw our role as somewhere in the middle. We're going to make sure that when this policy change actually happens, our community is not left behind, that they know what to do, they know what's coming up, they know what they have to sign up for. So we sort of pushed out this really big Cover California campaign. So we were one of the first organizations as education entity, outreach entity, certified enrollment entity, because we knew that was our role to play. So I think like 2011 is when I joined KCCEB, but it was somewhat of a weird calling. It was just such a random way. I found out that they had a position open, and I was like, oh, why don't I just send a resume, see what happens? And then it was like, oh, they're doing something that I was like hoping to get my feet into. So so I was leading that work. I was doing a lot of social services, direct services work. I also got pulled into immigration, legal assistance work. In 2016, I actually left grad school because I was hitting a phase where like, okay, I know what I'm seeing on the ground, but I want to learn kind of the theoretical perspective, or learn like framework to really see this in a more critical level. So I pursued grad school to do MSW, like PSA, but not on clinical route. But hey, we're fellow social workers, and also to study public health. So I left, and then 2000, as I graduated, I started getting like very kind of this mild hint of like, do you want to sort of kind of get re-engaged with KCCEB? I think the very first thing our boss, like June Lee, our executive director, said was like, oh, do you want to do like a consultant project with us?
Kind of slowly roped her.
Yeah, I was like,
in a little bit.
All right, consultant project. Okay, it doesn't seem like it's a commitment. It's more like a project based,
Consultant. As soon as, because I'll be honest with you, Talia Bennett is the executive director of HHREC. I've been working with her for over 10 years, right? Or about, I would probably say closer to 8 years. However, when I came in, I started as a consultant.
Consultant, quote.
That's how it always goes.
As soon as I told her, oh, the availability is open. Right this way. Come on, let's go. Let's go. Your program coordinator now.
Oh, God.
I think that's kind of what we did with Yeti, too.
Yeah, and the rest is history. I was like, oh, wait, what?
It was like less than a month into the project. I couldn't even finish the project because as soon as like a month in, like, do you just want to work full time? I'm like, I guess I can. And then I never got to finish the project. So there's that. It was like an evaluation. And I'm like, where's that? I don't even know where it is anymore. But yeah. And then actually it was really amazing when I came back because that was after P8 had joined the organization, after our colleague Amy has joined the organization. So it's almost like there was this like massive transition. It was like, in my experience, it was like KCCEB 2.0. And I didn't have to be there between the 1.0 and 2.0 jump. I just kind of got in where I'm like, oh, this jump was made and I'm here to stabilize together. So it's been fun, right? I think since then. Yeah.
But we are definitely a dynamic team, I have to say.
Yeah. And it's great because I think what I really actually appreciated with our current management, like including PCA, including June, was when they brought me back, it was like, hey, you've been with this organization before, and you know what changes or where it has been. And that's really important for us right now, that knowledge, because we need to know where our programs have been at so that as we're growing and expanding, we don't lose that. We don't lose that connection with our current clients, our community, and we still maintain that as we're growing rather than just getting disconnected from what we're used to be at. And I really appreciated that they appreciated that. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And so when was KCCEB founded and like how did you guys tackle, or really how did KCCEB first attempt to tackle socioeconomic issues, like you have your mental health issues, your medical issues? How did you guys tackle that together?
Ooh, that's a good question. So KCCEB, I think starting from the very roots, and I think as we talk a little bit about the timeline, I think it may become a little bit more clear. So KCCEB was established in 1977. Fun fact by, I think, UC Berkeley grad students who really just had the thought of like second generation helping first generation newly arriving immigrant families. So in the 70s, there was a huge wave of Korean immigrants coming to U.S. As like an aftermath of 1965 immigration reform. So the whole approach was like, there's new immigrants settling down. We're going to provide whatever settlement services it takes to help them settle in, but also like thrive and like live quality life. So they did, I think, everything like social services, daycare, job training, I think anything that they felt was necessary. So I think that was really interesting perspective now that I think about it, starting an organization. It's not about a very specific task or job, but it's like, we're going to do whatever it takes to make this community stand up, which now I think was a great approach because it allowed us to evolve with evolving needs of the community. So if we kind of look at the history, it started with that settlement services. We always held on to the social services piece, which is our legacy program. And that still stays until today. It just kind of revamped into community health access, but we still provide social services underneath that. And the constant question was like, what are the new needs? Like at one point we provide a youth program because a lot of community members came up to us saying, we want something intergenerational. We want our youth to learn about our roots and our history. So we actually did a lot of youth camps at some point until a lot of faith groups started offering it. We're like, okay, maybe that's something that's a need that now is served by other community sectors. So that's something we can move on and find something else that is not being met. And mental health was definitely one of them, because in 2012 and through 2014, we conducted Bay Area Korean Community Needs Assessment in partnership with UC Berkeley School of Public Health. And from there, the model that we took approach was we followed the community health interview survey. California, community health interviews. It's the CHIS survey from UCLA, which is supposed to be a gold standard to figure out, like, to assess community health, to assess community needs health and all of that. So we followed that model. And one of the biggest needs that we found was, one, health access. Either people were underinsured or uninsured. Two, language access. I think it was like over 40% of Koreans living in Bay Area who still felt that they were not comfortable with English. And then third was mental health. That's where we found out that Koreans are really at extreme high level of, at high risk of serious psychological distress, and then also one of the lowest service utilization rates. So that was a learning for us to say, okay, well, now what are we going to do now that we found this out? What can we do? What are current services out there? What are some of the gaps that we can fill in? And I think that was really the beginning point of our Asian Community Wellness Program. And I think, Pise, if you want to tackle on from this point.
Yeah, I think when we think about mental health services, we, like Yeri said, that a lot of our Korean, especially even API, have experienced a lot of mental health distress. But the access, being able to access services or wanting to access services, the penetration rate is so low. It can be like 2% or 4%, right, with our Asian Pacific Islander community. And we realized that in order to tackle mental health, especially with our Asian Community Wellness Program, was that we know that our community, they want concrete services. And a lot of it is the social services is what they come for, right? Or when they come, they share with you, physical health problems, right? I have stomach ache, I have headache, I have chronic pain, and I need help being able to access a doctor. How do I apply for Medi-Cal? How do I apply for, Cover California? And we realize as we're providing these services to them, and the trust is there, right? You sit there with our clients for an hour, 2 hours, filling out paperwork, and then, asking these questions. And the more we sit and the more we work and support them, the more trust they have with us. And that's when we start hearing stories about their migration, story about the trauma they've struggled with, story about intergenerational trauma, story about conflicts they have with their children and not knowing how to navigate that kind of tension, especially intergenerational tension. And a lot of our staff, for example, are not trained to be mental health counselors or even specialists or even understand. And because of that, but the folks come to them because why? I trust you. You are the one, you are there for me from the very beginning. You're KCCEB, right? And that's, we realize that we need more mental health provider there. We need to be able to be a bridge because they trust KCCEB. Whatever services that at KCCEB, we trust you. And from there, that's when the other branch, which is mental health, we knew that was one thing that was missing. We had social services, we had health access, right? We have immigration, all of those array of services. But the one thing that we need to expand on was mental health. And our staff, who's in those other various programs, they are the one that can walk the communities to access mental health services with our at KCCEB, and it's as simple as a warm handoff, right? Or it could be, we actually train them how to be able to screen and detect signs and symptoms of mental health, and they will have a conversation with their client, saying, like, 2 hours of social services and helping fill out, housing application or Medi-Cal application. They hear the stories, and they can just say, "Wow, that's a lot. That's very heavy. What you share with me. You've been through so much." And it sounds like you're struggling with a lot of stressor. And that stressor is also making you feel anxious or you may be experiencing a traumatic event. We have a program here called, Asian Community Wellness Service, a program. And you can, we have someone you can talk to support you with all these challenges and struggle. and I can actually introduce you to them. Do you want to schedule a next appointment so we can meet that person? They're more likely to be open to that than to just give you a piece of referral. It's like, hey, looks like you're experiencing these symptoms.
Yeah.
So here's a piece of
place to
paper.
go to.
This is the organization, and it doesn't work with our community. We understand that. We engage with them through case management, through social services, and build that relationship with them, build that trust, and then be able to help walk them or to navigate them through the next step, which is to be able to, access mental health services. And so that's the beauty of ACMHS. And also that's the beauty of KCCEB is like we're sort of like this one-stop shop
One-stop
center.
shop.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you don't have to drive to another building
place.
or another place. And then, a counselor is like next door. And then you can just literally walk out the room or, hey, our staff was like, come here, let me introduce you, to a counselor right here. So, and I think that makes such a big difference in connecting immediately and there's no barriers.
And if I were to add, I think a lot of the challenges that our community members are facing they're all interwoven and also fluid, right? So in a way, our service has to be in that fashion too. Be ready to sort of meet where clients are. Where if one issue turns into another, we have to be fluid to sort of adapt to that as well. This is actually, as I was getting ready for this podcast, I don't know why this incident just remembered. This is when I was doing social services at KCCEB, doing direct services. And we have a lot of clients who are like what we call regular clients. So we would see them like once a month or once every month because they have Medi-Cal renewal, they have this, then, So they come to us, and it was this gentleman who was probably like a little bit older than my father's age. And he would come in for some of the other social services, what we call quote unquote typical social services. And one day he brought in this new issue, which was, I'm trying to tell my doctor I need this help, but I can't get through to him. So one, there was a language issue. When I talked to him, I was like, oh, okay, so your doctor doesn't speak Korean. Okay, that's one issue to start off with, right? And then two was, this was one of the few clients who was realizing that they needed mental health support, but was not getting it. And I was just asking him questions like, okay, so what have you done? Like, did you try to tell the doctor that you need help, or like, where is this going? And he was just saying that I just have a really hard time explaining to him, I need this. He's kind of dismissing it, saying, I don't really need that help. So I asked him, like, kind of like a homework, like, okay, well, why don't we make another appointment? Why don't you write down some things that you feel like is really crucial to tell him? And maybe I could help you like write that in English, because I can't accompany you to your, hospital appointment. But the very least thing I can do is maybe help you write some notes down in English, and maybe you can show it to him, and then that could start a conversation. Next time he comes back, he has pages of things that he wrote, and it's about the nightmares he was having. So it turns out he was a Korean War veteran. And at the time, I had like no training about mental health, but even I could tell this is PTSD. This is what PTSD looks like. Because in writing, he's talking about like, in his nightmare, he's seeing like his, like fellow soldiers, like like heads getting chopped off, or, just all kinds of things. And this is like really descriptive. And I'm like, and your doctor is dismissing this. You're telling him, obviously you have a PTSD, you need help. And you're admitting and you're acknowledging, I need help. And your doctor is not like allowing you or referring you to see a mental health specialist. That is not okay. So we made some calls and whatnot, but it just like sticks to my head. I'm like, oh my God. And back then, if we had our mental health program, we would have been able to like connect them to the services. But even then, I still remember feeling like I was hitting a wall too. I'm like, what do we do with this? How do we get through that doctor? And now that I thinking about those, like, I don't want our community members, I want to prevent as much as we can for community members to go through those walls. Like I'm trying to get to this point A, but I can't get there. But you help me with this other part B. So can you help me get to part A somehow?
Exactly.
And I think it's such an interwoven thing, because he did have that trust with us, and that's why he was able to open up with us. And if we could I wish we would have been in a better position then to say, and let me connect you to the help you need, because I think we have someone that could help you. And that's where we're trying to get to now, right? Is where like no wrong door, and at the same time, once you're in the door, you could you navigate through everything through with us.
And I think what's beautiful is that we are definitely a bridge. from one, service to another, right? Whether it's social services, whether it's health access services, whether it's immigration services, whether it's, other community services, we become the bridge that connect them all. And so our community doesn't feel like, they're overwhelmed or just not heard. That's the most important part, is just not feeling heard. And a lot of times we know that our community, because language, there's sort of like the language barrier is two things, right? There's fear and there's shame to a certain extent, I see, right? The fear that, I don't know what to say. If I say this way, it might come out wrong. But there's also shame where I'm in America. I grew up, this is how crazy it is. I grew up, growing up in a small rural town in Bakersfield. On the radio, the first thing they do is that this is America. You should only speak English.
Mhm.
Imagine immigrants and refugees hearing that, right? And then knowing that they have limitation with, speaking English, that they're monolingual speaking. And now all these services are kind of all in English, and they have to learn how to navigate that, but also they have to communicate that. And to a certain extent, they feel really, really scared, right? And invisible. And also the word that we use, we talk about, a different language. But let's talk about culture.
Yeah.
How we communicate mental health is very different. And many communities don't even have the word for mental health.
It's sort of, and I'll speak on the Latin community. In my lived-in experience, when I was deemed a bad child,
Mhm.
when I was deemed a child of mischief, or a young man, a young boy or adolescent of color, would just get into all types of stuff. They ended up trying to kick me out of school, but thankfully, I had family members who dealt with some type of mental health, and I was able to go see a doctor for the first time ever in my life. And when the doctor told me, "Hey, you got diagnosed with ADHD," right? I was like, "Well, what is that?" He was like, "Take these pills. Take all these pills. Take all this medication." And I'm like, "Okay, well, one medication wants to make me like vomit. One medication wants to make me feel sleepy. One gives me even more energy."
Mm-hmm.
And it took a very long time for me to realize, it's not about having that stigmatization of, you now have something. It's like, hey, there's nothing wrong with you speaking out about, your mental health issues and what you got going on. It's really on how you address them.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And for that veteran to come to you, Yeti, and you had no experience, but you knew kind of what it was because you've seen it, in the circle. That speaks volumes, because you were taught, and you learned, and you associated, and you kind of like indulged in the knowledge of, hey, this man needs help. Period, point blank. Like,
Mhm.
he's going through all of this. He's writing it out. We need to get him some help. And you knew that at where you were at, even though you had no, I would say, prior, PTSD experience or any training on it, but you knew what it was. And that's the same thing for me. I knew what ADHD. I know what ADHD is. I know what PTSD is. I know what these things look like because I've lived an experience with family members who have dealt with it. So now when I see a young man or a young woman come in and they tell me, "Hey, I feel like there's a weight on my chest. I feel like I have to throw up. I feel like I have to just scream out my problems." I'm like, "Okay, well, have you seen a mental health specialist? Have you worked with someone just to talk about your feelings? Have you, do you just want to talk to me about it? I'm not going to diagnose you, but I can definitely give you recommendations on what you may have or what you can see in the future, things like that." So again, it all stems back to people with lived-in experiences being in the community, doing this community work, and actually wanting to do the work. There's a difference between taking a paycheck and don't really care about the paycheck. You just want to change people's lives. And I appreciate you both for actually wanting to do the work, because it speaks volumes in the way you're talking about your community, talking about how, the work impacts you on a personal level and on a professional level. And I think this goes straight into the next question. What mental health issues were community members suffering from at the time when you guys joined on to KCCEB?
So when I joined KCCEB around 2018, a lot of our API communities, Korean community, and KCCEB expanded to serve even Asian Pacific Islanders community as well. Um, when we see their struggles, we see a lot of what we call collective and historical trauma, right? Trauma from migration or trauma of loss. Especially, I work with a few Cambodian elder, and they've experienced, similar to my parents and my lived experience, a lot of intergenerational trauma. And then for our elders, Korean, what they've survived, I think Yeri can share more, is sort of their post-war generation. So they have, like similar to the veteran she just shared about, a lot of PTSD surviving that and or experiencing loss and not knowing how to navigate. Because many times a lot of our API, especially our older generation, still doesn't fully understand like what is mental health, right? Sometimes there's no lingo. And at the same time, they come from an era where we don't talk about this. Like, right, if you're a survivor of any form of trauma, especially our elders, that we don't want to re-traumatize our kids. That's their way of saying. So if we don't talk about it, we don't discuss it, my kids will be okay. They'll be great. Yeah. They're going to make it. They're going to be successful. Lawyers, doctors, and teachers. That's how it works, right? Guess what? They don't talk about it, but it manifests through their behavior, through their physical health, right? Through their sleep disturbances. And that's what we're kind of noticing, where the children now are experiencing intergenerational trauma. And many times for parents who actually are diagnosed with PTSD or other traumas, their children usually are diagnosed with anxiety, depression, right? Or other kind of mood disorder. So it doesn't go away as we think our parents. I know our parents or our elder generation are trying to protect us, and everything is out of good intention. But when it comes to wounds, and these traumas are wounds, if you don't heal it, it would just continue down the family generation and the family line. And that's what we kind of notice. And then also a lot of intergenerational conflicts as well. Because you have what we call the sandwich generation, right? You have parents who are immigrants and then children who were either came here as children or were born here second gen, but then they're living between American culture and then Asian culture. They go home, they have to live by this Asian culture of like you have to perform a certain way. If you do something bad, it's a reflection on our family. So, don't misbehave. Don't be, like you said, the bad kid, right? But you have to be successful. And if you're struggling with depression or so on, or anxiety or depression, especially in the API community, you're deemed as lazy because you're not motivated enough and it's ignored, right? So a lot of our youth are hiding and not even wanting to let their parents know. Especially I work with a lot of my youth. They don't want their parents to know that they're receiving counseling. And their first response is that my parents won't understand that. And one of my youth, Asian youth, she actually shared with her mom, like, I want counseling. I want see a therapist. Is like, what's that? You don't have a problem. You just need to focus at school. And that's what the message that they're receiving, especially our API youth. And then, another thing we talk about is assimilation and culturation, right? Adjustment disorder. Change is tough when you're trying to move from one country to another and you're leaving everything that you know, your norms, your friends, your connections, your status, to come to a country where you sort of have to start from the bottoms up. Right? You can be like a professional in your home country and you come here and then you lost all that status, right? And you're starting from the ground up again. So that itself is definitely a struggle in more ways than one.
Yeah. Just kind of wrapping up what P says, sort of blending it all together about the Korean, like older generation that we're assisting. It's interesting because there is that like historical trauma. So a lot of the older generation here are like post-colonialism and then going into like right after being finally freed from or liberated from Japan, like Korean War just happened. And then so they kind of gone through post-aftermath experience of all of that. Or even as a younger child, they actually experienced it firsthand. Like my father, who's in his 70s, he still has a memory of fleeing North Korea with his mom. And he has that memory of like, we were somewhere trying to get on the train to leave North Korea and to move to South Korea and somehow find our way there. So I think there's these seniors elderly who has gone through that. Now they grew up in kind of like in that post-war poverty, trying to build their lives in a country that was just literally burned down into ashes. And then decided to move to the U.S. to seek for a better opportunity for their kids. So there's this, I think there's a generation gap of like, look what we've been gone through. This is all the stuff that we had to deal with in history. And we came here giving up everything that we're used to build a new life. And then looking at them like, why is this so difficult for our younger generation? Like there's that generational gap, perspective difference, right? So I think there's that assimilation difficulty, but also going into like, hey, you guys didn't have to deal with the war.
Yeah.
Like, why is this so difficult for
why
you?
is it so hard for you?
Yeah.
It's crazy because it's the same thing. You know, I see it daily. You know, when I ask my mother, you know, hey, I'm going through these things. She's like, well, why are you going through them? I didn't deal with those things. I've had to deal with A, B, and C, and I was way worse than what you have to deal with today. And what most people don't realize is, you know, the generations, you know, there's Gen Z, Gen Y, Gen X, you know, millennials, elders, boomers. It's crazy because it's all a misunderstanding between all of the generations. And it's all, like you said, it's all perspective based, where one generation is going through a different set of, you know, outcomes.
Right.
The older generation doesn't see that because they didn't experience it. Again, it's all about lived in experience. And maybe if Gen Z experienced what the millennials experienced, maybe they would have a better connection, right? Same thing with the elders. Say if elders, you know, shared about their experiences and they ask, you know, like a teenager, hey, I've gone through all of this. Can you relate to that? No, you can't relate to that. And same thing, vice versa. So I definitely get what you're saying.
Yeah. So I think it's like a mix of all of that. Like there's this generation that dealt with like war, post-war, and, you know, all of that trauma. And then they come here bringing that, as Pise said, they bring that. And then there's a younger generation who are also having their challenges and having their struggles. But that gap of that unexperienced, like that's something that they didn't experience is there. And I think I'm still processing with my family of how to come about this, because my parents have their experience. My sister, who's actually like Gen X, we have a little bit of age gap. And I'm like the millennial baby. So it's like three of us or three parties trying to figure this out. And I think what I came to terms with, and I had this discussion with my mom too, is like, you know, immigration experience is really hard on everybody in the family, whether it's a kid, whether it's a teenager, whether it's the adults, and everybody is going to have their own battle. And you just won't know it because you will not have that firsthand experience being in the other person's shoes. And it is what it is. And only thing we can do is trying to talk it out, conversate, which is also a really hard thing to happen in Asian families. But, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah.
But maybe that's one of the reasons why we want to do that in the work we do, to have those conversations and to have those like bridging piece, to become that bridging piece between the generations, because it's hard to do it within the family, but maybe in the community it's a little easier.
How Pise was saying, you know, your teens came to you and they're like, I don't want my parents to know. Well, it makes sense that if parents don't want to know, if they're not talking about it at home, if it gets shunned on at home, why would I want to talk about it, period?
And you also talk about, you know, generation experience, right? Every generation have their own way of like, we need to survive, right? Our parents is surviving, just trying to adjust, trying to make ends meet, trying to make our lives, our children, not to deal with the struggles and the hardship that they've experienced. Therefore, like we said, when it comes to trauma, we don't talk about it because we don't want to burden our children with these pains and horrors. But in the end of the day, we end up just becoming a residual of it regardless, right? So, and that's where we want to shift when it comes to mental health with our API community, is that, you know, as Asians or API, we don't talk, we quote do, right? How do we express love? We put food on the table. We make you a delicious meal. If you're sick, we feed you, you know, chicken soup. But we don't say, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Are you feeling okay? We don't do that, right? And it is a culture shift. And for us, I think our role, you know, we talk about, we are the bridge, right? Is to bringing both world together and bringing both generation together to be at a table where we can sit and eat and bake, you know, and break bread and eat a delicious meal together, but then have conversation, these difficult conversations sometimes, you know, to be able to just hear stories. And I think that, you know, maybe one of the reasons why the mental health resonate with me, because despite of what my parents struggle or go through, there are moments when we dine together, my parents would share their experience. and sometimes their pain, but also sometimes their achievement, and they're being able to overcome so many obstacles. That gives me hope to a certain extent. And I want to be able to have an opportunity to replicate that for all of our communities, right? Every youth that comes my path, or different communities who are struggling with mental health and struggling to even find a voice to talk about mental health.
Yeah, and I do it with this generation who I work with day to day. I let up, I got youth who I've worked with like 5 years ago. They still call me and ask me, hey, like how do I find resources? How do I? But it's really about the community work.
Mm-hmm.
If you're about the community work and the community trusts you, the community will come to you regardless of where you're at. They will find a way,
Mm-hmm.
high, low, rain, sun, or shine. I'll tell you what. But now they're speaking about community. So how big is the KCCEB community?
Oh dear.
That is so much bigger, but let's start from the beginning.
Oh dear. Wow. So I think what makes it harder is that each of our programs kind of have different audience in a way. So like for Asian Community Wellness Program, because our focus is Alameda County, it kind of stays within the Alameda County boundaries, and there we have various age groups. For programs like Community Health Access Program, the Bay Area Korean Info Line, so those kind of go beyond any county borders. So I would say we get clients mainly from like the 9 Bay Area counties. So it's whoever requests service, regardless of where they live. If like, especially pre-COVID, if they could make it to our office, we would provide the service, was really what it was. We're like, oh, you want to come all day from San Jose? I mean, we are here to help, but do you want to find anything closer to you? Because you have to drive for an hour. Yeah. And for something like the info line, which is like our 2-on-1 kind of for Korean community, it's like a 2-on-1 like resource navigation info line that we answer live in Korean from like 9 to 5, except the lunchtime, of course, Monday through Friday. For those, we get about 9 to 10,000 calls a year. That's our call volume.
Wow.
And the coverage, because I sometimes have to pull this data, is, of course, majority, like I would say the biggest group is from Alameda County because we're just so well known. But we get from the rest of the 9 counties, going beyond that from SoCal. We always have folks calling from out of state. So that covers from like Jersey City, New York, going up Oregon and Seattle, definitely Texas and Arizona. I think recently we had calls from Arizona. So I would say, I don't know, the biggest number I could pull is 9,000. That's the call volume. So average call volume, it's about 9,000 calls, individuals, and then covering mainly from Alameda County, but to the Bay Area, but also beyond. So.
No, that's awesome. It's great to hear that there's a very strong positive wording or verbiage from the community that they're able to be like, hey, you can get resources from here. Like it's not even Alameda County, but there's resources right over here for you.
They call for everything. We're like the safety net hub for everything, and I think. Yeah, that's just a word of mouth. I mean, that's where we're well known for that. And the community knows like, hey, if you have a problem, call KCCEB. So we're not only the social services, we might be the love match as well. But
we've had folks asking about matchmaking. We've also had, I think our ED literally picked up the call, someone asking her, I lost my luggage in San Francisco airport. Can I get help on this? And she's like, I don't know what to do about this. I don't even like lost and found. I don't know.
But yeah, that's amazing that, even like I said, individuals from different states, they're willing to call just a random organization that they've heard about from word to mouth and just immediately be like, hey, I trust you guys, right? That right there, you can't buy that with money. That is like the pinnacle of the work you guys do. So with that question out of the way, and I'm sorry, Yuri, too. That was like a loaded question.
I'm like, where do I start?
So are you guys handling kind of any community, based problems differently? Obviously COVID came up and things of that nature. So how did you guys pivot or shift for that certain pandemic?
That's a whole
whole
nother hour.
Oh my gosh.
Conversation.
I felt like a workload double, like small organization, just double a workload.
Weren't allowed to go into that office, so.
Oh yeah. So
and then in layman's terms, like how was the pivot?
It was really tough. Tough, but it had to happen. I think that's
tough and
really
quick. It
tough
was
and
more of
quick,
like our
and we
community
had to do
needed
it.
us. Doesn't matter what our services are, we got to expand our services fast. They need all of these issues. So Yeti can share more, and I'll add in.
I'll start and then please add in. Yeah. So the interesting thing about for me that's really helpful for me is because I'm supervising our info line, which is the front line of the front lines. So we can immediately sense like, oh, okay, something's going on. Oh, okay, this is what's happening with the community. Because like all of a sudden we have like 50 calls coming in asking about this one thing. So we know that's a thing. So when pandemic became officially a pandemic and all these various, like whether it's economic resources, whether it's about just testing, just all of these questions were flooding in. I think our call volume usually per month, I don't know, it's like, I can't do math, 9,000 divided by 12. Anyway, it doubled. It doubled and almost tripled by the time we hit June. To the point where we were worried about our staff burnout because it's such a like flooding of calls asking about things that we also didn't know and have answers for. Like people are asking about like, I don't know how I'm going to apply for this pandemic, relief program. And all we know is that there was announcement. There's no details of how this is getting implemented, but people are calling because they saw it on TV. It's going to happen. So you guys should know the answer. And we're like, we definitely do not. But let me look it up for you. So I think as we were kind of getting hit with this like initial flood of inquiries and people asking for help, we had to figure out like, okay, what is it that the community needs right now? Who are the most vulnerable groups? Let's assess that and then see what we can do about it. So I think it was actually PC's idea where we have this, because of the calls we're getting in, we're able to capture a lot of the information. So we found like 550 senior contacts in this area. And we started doing like, let's just do assessment calls. Just call out, see what they need. Do they have access to food? Do they have access to medication? Can they get PPEs? Like just asking them the very basic needs that's going on right now that is not being met. And we found a few different things. Food was a big thing. A lot of them did not have the mobility. They couldn't get food. They couldn't go out there. So there were people who were rationing their meals. And then there were folks who were like, I can't get PPEs because at the time, like nobody was able to buy like hand sanitizers, masks, unless you pay like 10 times more than what it usually.
They were gone.
Yeah. So there was all of that. So we were making those assessments and then seeing like, okay, then we need to start securing PPEs, whether it's through our funders, whether it's through this. Let's try to see if we could start a food program by fundraising, by applying to different foundation grants and whatnot. And then a lot of seniors were feeling isolated. So we thought about like, well, can we start like almost like a wellness check, wellness call, like a friendship line, almost like a
sort of warm line. Yeah, wellness warm line.
And it was interesting because my expectation when PCA suggested like maybe we could do something like this, I'm like, I don't know. Do you think there's going to be a lot of people asking for that? I wasn't sure. And then I think about 20% of the seniors that we reached out to were like, yeah, I want you to call back.
Out of 500, we had 120 wanting the wellness check. So that was huge when it comes to the API community, especially our Asian elders.
Yeah.
That's huge.
And hearing again what you're saying, Asian elders, they don't like to talk about their problems. They don't like to talk about, what's going on. For them to be like, please call back.
Exactly. I want to hear your voice.
Yeah.
And it also reminded of like, how we do have to go that extra mile. Because one of the cases that really stuck with me was when we did our initial assessment for the 550, we actually found out one of our seniors became homeless in this entire process. And he has come to our agency before. He knows our contact, but he didn't ask us for help, right? Because we reached out to him and then realized like, oh, you're currently homeless. You're living in your car. Oh, and you have a chronic heart disease. And you're not getting your medication right now. And it was just multiple things, like multiple layers of things that he was dealing with. And he said that when we reached out to him, when our staff called him, he was starting to think that like, maybe this is it. And maybe this is where it's going to end for me because I just don't see a way out. And when we reached out to him, he's like, okay, maybe there is some little bit of hope, right? So I think his case was when we said, okay, we're not doing in-person services, but you're coming in person. We're going to help you apply for these public benefits because we need you to get off your feet right now. We're going to call, because we found out where he was a previous patient at. So we actually found out a way to connect to the patient navigator there. And we just asked him, like, is there any way you can just get his prescription filled? Like, we know there's a wait to see the doctor, but anyway, you can just get the medication filled so that he could start taking his meds again. So it was a lot of that. But I think what I realized was like, wow, it's really hard for a community to ask for help sometimes. And we have to reach out to them. And we have to be at the most reachable place. So I think that was a lesson that I learned then.
And I will say, even, dealing with the pandemic, I was 2021 pandemic, so I was like kind of mid post pandemic, but even dealing with that on this side for pretty much all multi-ethnic groups with stakeholder groups, it was a warm call. I had to do a warm call because I had to make sure and remind my Tay that, hey, there is someone here for you. There's someone who cares about you. You just don't fall off the face of the earth, please. Please give me a call back. Thank you. And almost 80% gave me a call back. It was like, I haven't heard from someone in so long. I've been feeling very isolated. School is boring because it is all online. I've been depressed. I've been, I've had anxiety. My anxiety has spiked through the roof. And what I ended up building out of that was my young men's, because a lot of young men that I talked to didn't really have that person to talk to. However, the young women, there's a lot of programs and advocacy for young women's mental health. But what I ended up opening was my young men of color's mental health forum, and I host that every month. And that's all started from me just giving young men a call and asking them, hey, do you need to know? You just want someone to talk to real quick. How are you doing? So I definitely understand where that man was coming from and where you guys are coming from. Because it is one thing for them to call you and ask for help, but it is another thing for the actual community-based provider to, reach out to their community who they're supposed to be serving and, ask that question like, hey, are you okay? So that's wonderful to hear. I'm so happy you guys pivoted that way.
And it's amazing. I mean, likewise, it's amazing that you've done that work and it started and it bloomed into something.
Yeah.
Blossoming.
And I think for us, it bloomed into us actually, having a lot of different programs. One is our meal program where we actually deliver meals directly to our Korean elders in the community. We have grown, first initially we grown from San Francisco County to Contra Costa County to Alameda County. We started from there, and then as we continued to get funding, we had to downsize. But the fact that without that call, without that initial assessment, without reaching out to our Korean, isolated elders, we wouldn't have known all these issues with food insecurity, the isolation, the need to be able to get support, right? The lack of resources like PPE because they couldn't go out. And knowing that one wellness check could be life-saving. That's huge, right? If we had waited, he may not have been there, right? But the fact that one of our staff was able to call and he picked up the phone and we sensed something was not right. We sensed something that he needed more support than just a phone call. And we basically mobilize and get him into a case management program, help him apply for benefits, have him come in despite him knowing, even though we had, remote work, but we knew that there was a need. We actually basically, like I said, meet where our community is at. That's what we did. And in a way, it was a life-saving, kind of support that we did for him.
It was a life-saving
It was.
support.
Yes,
That
it was.
It wasn't a life. It was a
It
life-saving
was. Yes,
support.
I agree. So for that, we are grateful for the just really pivoting a lot of our work and continuing to do all the other jobs, right? Just adding on. But we knew that we needed to be there for our community. And I think another pivot was that KCCEB, like many, I think API organizations, sometimes we work a lot in silo, especially Korean organization. With the pandemic, a lot of us as nonprofit, especially Korean run nonprofit, realized we needed to come together. We needed to come together and we needed to be a strong front because our community needed us. So what happened was that KCCEB, along with, Korean
American Community Foundation, San Francisco, and then some other Korean nonprofit organizations like Korean American Community Services in Silicon Valley. All the K acronyms are floating away.
Came together, yeah.
Korean Center Inc.
And we actually formed a Korean coalition, and we are still going strong today and really addressing issues that impact our community, especially when we hear certain things. Like, so the food program also came from that. Other advocacy came from that. So, and then also I think in light of the Atlanta shooting, we actually organized sort of a healing, conference and memorial for that too. So I think that was the pivot. We actually became, instead of working in silo like we used to do, the pandemic really brought us all together not only as a community, but as an organization, even a larger community, but also a stronger voice to advocate for all the issues that our community needs.
So it was like, hey, there's a worldwide problem. Guess what? We're about to become family.
Don't get angry. Get organized.
It's true.
Organized.
It's very true, because I think that's when we ask, like, okay, it's not about who does what, but like, what is your strength? And that's all you need to contribute, right? And of course, that means you may have to work a little more hours, but it is. We do have full-time work and plus a little bit more, but like KCCEB, because we're on the front lines, we're able to share, like, this is what we're hearing from the community. People are asking about all these questions. And then that's when, like, for example, Korean American Bar Association of Northern California, like, well, we could order legal clinics if people have questions about, like, PPL loans or
unemployment,
and unemployment and who's eligible for what. Like, we could gather up our, attorneys and just do, like, weekly, every weekend do free legal clinics. So, like, that's kind of like organically coming together that way. I think was really fun.
Yeah.
Lots of work at the time because we were pivoting and we're like, oh, we're working like 12 hours a day now.
Sometimes 15,
over the weekends.
But what was interesting is that we knew there were some challenges, especially language was a huge challenge. A lot of materials that was printed, it was not in our API language. So what did we do? We took the English, and then one of our Korean organization partner, what they do is a lot of translation. We brought in all the COVID materials, and we literally just translate everything in Korean.
Hey, here's a pile of paper.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It was literally that. And then we said, okay, how do we share this with the community? How do we partner with public health? How do we partner with the counties to make that happen? And how do we advocate instead of just KCCEB advocating, it's a K coalition coming to you and saying, this is what our community needs. So there's that power of numbers. And I think that really engaged us to organize more, to really be able to push for a lot of change during the pandemic. So,
and again, it's amazing to know that your guys' organization not only pivoted, but did a strong pivot by the K Coalition, and then also a very smart and analytical and logical pivot. Because I know many different, small-based organizations. I'm not saying nonprofits, small-based organizations. In general, they didn't know how to deal with the issue or deal with the problem, and ended up, having to close their doors or ended up having to, lose staff or things of that nature. So it's good. It was amazing, really, to hear that. Like, again, you did a very, strong pivot because you did it together, but you also did a very analytical, logical, and you planned out your pivot. And I think that goes into our next question. So our next question is, how has KCCEB evolved into what it is today, and how? Now, we talked about the pivot and how you guys have, shifted amazingly, by the way. Now, it's sort of, or the next question I want to get into is, how have you guys evolved, from that pivot? What are some amazing things, or really programs, that have blossomed from the pandemic, or really the pivot?
I would say it's nothing brand new per se, but I think it gave us a better perspective about evolving with the evolving needs of the community. I think it reassured that for us. So for example, for one of the projects that we're doing for mental health is actually developing mental health support apps. And one of them is Community Thrive. And this is an app for to support Korean-speaking small business owners who's been recently exposed to community violence. So it's about how to address post-incident issues, whether it's oh, you have to, support, you have to submit a report so you can do the insurance claim. It's like something tangible like that, but all the way to like, okay, if you are experiencing that you are impacted emotionally from this, like how do you get help? How do you get support? And I think what that really taught us is meeting where clients are at, recognizing the needs, but at the same time coming down and providing what the community is requesting for, at the same time bringing in the extra resources that we think would be something that's supported for the community in the long run. So one of the things is, for example, we talked about the food program. The way I think the beauty of the food program was that we were providing culturally specific food to Korean seniors, but at the same time, that funding was going to the vendors, the small businesses who were also suffering at the time. So there was like a Korean business who opened 3 months before COVID. So they were just ready to shut down their store. And then we approached them about this program. So they were getting basically paid to make this food to serve the seniors. And then as we started engaging the vendors, we realized what some of the challenges were. Because they were limited English proficient. And when they do experience like vandalism or someone breaks into their window or something happens overnight, they don't know what to do. And they also don't know what kind of resources are out there. Like they don't know there's victim support if somebody did get hurt. So as we're realizing that, and we're like, well, obviously you probably need someone to talk to after this either, right? But at the same time, that's not their immediate concern. They're like, I have a broken window. I don't care if I'm sleepless at night. I need to fix that window. Mm-hmm. It's not about me being sleepless at night. That's important, right? So we realize as we're developing that app, like, okay, we have to meet them where they're at. Them asking about, I need you to provide me tangible support in XYZ things so I can get on and move on with my life, running my business. But here's us thinking like, don't you also need mental health support? Don't you also not like someone to talk to? Because they do deal with that acute trauma. Mm-hmm. It's just not for them their priority because they feel like there's these other things that they have to do. So I think kind of juggling those two things and making conscious decision and being intentional about how we design our programs, I think that's our continuous evolution.
And tying to that, I mean, when we talk about the pandemic, let's not forget about the AAPI hate that's been happening or the anti-Asian sentiments and violence that's been happening to our community, mm-hmm. especially with our elders, Asian elders, right? They were the one that you see on media being targeted nonstop. So how we evolve in that is we know that was going to be a major trauma that we have to address one way or another. And what we did was that we actually hosted our Tai Chi's program. We do Tai Chi classes to serve our elders to, we do risk of falling or for better movement. And we then incorporate a safety self-defense class. We actually did various videos to show how to be able to, be safe in the community when you're out, how to defend yourself and, and make sure that you do it in a way where, depending on your age and so on, to do it safely. And that was one way of really being able to address the needs of our elders, especially who are confronted with anti-Asian sentiments and violence in the community. And by doing that, we want to expand it where we can engage them to have conversation about their experiences. And then hopefully, be able to provide support groups for them and engage them to be able to seek counseling if need be. And again, this is because we have to meet the needs of our community where they're at. And a lot of them are really afraid. Many times when we contact them through the wellness check, we now include the questions about, do you feel safe in your community, right? Have you been impacted by the anti-Asian violence and sentiments happening in the community? And many of them will respond, yes, they are afraid because they may have a neighbor who's been impacted. Or some would even say that I'm more scared about the violence than I am of COVID and being afraid to leave home because of that. So we're shifting that to in a way that, and then also when we do our care kit, it's not just the COVID care kit, it's also a safety kit. We actually give them materials and resources how to report a hate crime in different languages from Korean, Chinese, Tagalog, and to be able to give to the community so they know who to contact, how to communicate, what number to push to have you, to speak your own language. And then to provide whistles or alarms as they're walking in the communities and give them basic education of, how to make sure you're safe. So we have even evolved to that in order to really reduce any kind of distress that they're experiencing, right? When you don't feel safe in your community, you're going to feel more and more isolated. And we wanted to find ways to support them to make sure that they feel empowered, they're safe, but also empowered. So that's really one other areas that we actually evolved at KCCEB. One other thing we wanted to add too is that a lot of our elders, we have the digital divide, right? Our elders, with especially technology. It's, as you said, when you were talking about the iPad, about how do I do this? How do I navigate Zoom? We actually hosted some of our wellness class in like virtual, especially our Korean elders, not Korean elders, Korean and Chinese, the Tai Chi class. And then we were able to engage our elders, to actually host Tai Chi's in a virtual realm versus in person. Usually we always do it in person. So that itself is sort of an evolution too, that we are using technology to reach out to the community beyond just local. Mm-hmm. And that's really important as well. And being able to share the resources that we have more so.
And I think just to add to the resources is, I think we are very intentional about engaging the community as we're developing resources. Resource development is actually one of the, pieces of KCCEB's mission. And as we're developing them, we want to make sure that it actually reflects what community needs and community finds useful. So for example, with the safety videos, we actually had a certain idea of what kind of curriculum we wanted to follow, but we brought it back to our senior support group and just asking, we showed them some of the videos that was on the news of what the incidents that happened. And then we asked them, what do you think would have been helpful? Here's some things that we have in mind. Would you find that helpful? And a lot of their feedback was really, it kind of actually helped us reshape our curriculum, because a lot of the comments we got was like, self-defense is great, but if I can't remember it, like I want something that's really useful that I can use without having to master this particular move, right? Mm-hmm. How to take falls safely. I'm not going to be able to prevent anybody pushing me from the behind, but if I do get pushed, how am I going to take a fall easily without, incurring greater damage, or like some props I can use. So I think we had to sort of repivot in that sense too. And we're really grateful about that, because we want it to be useful at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And same with Community Thrive was we really started off with how can we provide mental health support for these community business owners. And then the immediate response we got was like, help me figure this out, because this is stress for me. If I can't file this and then, get this needs met or fix this damage to move on and, get back on my feet so I could support my family, like that's the stress. Like I don't have to talk to anybody right now. I need that to get away I need that to go away so I could stop stressing about it. Mm-hmm. So I think taking those seriously and say, okay, we're going to listen to where the community is at and go from there. I think that's kind of our approach with the resource development too. And hopefully we hope to stay that way, to take that approach continuously.
And that's amazing, hearing again, the pivot, the evolution. You took something and you were like, you know what? You didn't assume what your community needed. Mm-hmm. You went to them and you asked them, hey, what do you need? We got you. We will help you. We just need to know what you need. And then from there, your programs were organically built from the needs of your community. And not to say they were brand new, it was just something that it was like an expansion almost, right? So you expanded on already what you were doing. And you also did it virtually, because you were saying with the Tai Chi class, you did it virtually, which is amazing, awesome. And now here is another loaded question.
Uh-oh.
So where do you see KCCEB moving into the future? Like what is the future for the organization in your guys' eyes? Yeah. I know the organization as a whole is not here, but in your guys' perspective, where would you like to see, in the next 5-10 years? Where would you see?
Before we answer that, I actually want to go back briefly about our organization evolving. Oh, yeah, we talk about KCCEB evolving, right? We don't talk about our community evolving as well, too. And what I noticed, and this is really huge, is that before, right, we seek out our community and they come to us and they just, gets the services. What shifted is that now they're telling us what their needs are. That's huge, right? That's really having confidence and feeling empowered and having a voice and saying, you know what? This is what's important to us. Instead of just accepting the service as is, they are now the ones who has the voice to change what they need. And then we are the one that's actually following them. We are basically reaching out to them and getting their feedback. And that's pretty much the model, the empowerment model. So we are actually doing that, and we're seeing that that evolution of our community, finding that voice, finding that strength, and saying, this is not working. This is what you need to do to make it work.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, we're listening, right? And so I think that's beautiful, right? So we, in a way, have, that's the purpose. And I think we have fulfilled some purpose of, the purpose of what KCCB is, empowerment.
Yep.
And I think our community is evolving to feel empowered, to actually now use their voice to make the change they want to see. So I'm going back to the future of KCCEB. Yeti, would you like to start?
Wait, really? I'm coughing. Wow. Actually, you may have to start because I'm about to say.
Okay. So one of the things, you saw how we have grown, right, from just these social services to now to even expand to our culturally responsive meal delivery program, to even, providing like virtual and digital services as well. And then even going to engaging our elder more, and also advocacy pieces of our elders, or community members, really specifically sharing their needs. One thing I do want to touch on is that one thing that I envision, or I see where KCCB going is, again, continue to expand our resources. But one of the area is really thinking about, with mental health services, how to have mental health services really without borders, right? Right now, we live in a community or a system where we're all there's barriers, right? Barriers of counties, barriers of state line, barriers of, health insurance. And we're realizing that through our Baki, through our Bay Area Korean Community Info Lines, that we're getting called for mental health services outside Alameda County, in the Bay Area, right? In SoCal, outside of the U.S., and realizing is that they are wanting bilingual, bicultural services, mental health services, who can speak their language and provide that services. And we're realizing we have limitations because of the programs or deliverables that we need to meet. And so, and why I think that's important is that when we think about the pandemic, right, the next pandemic that is going to happen, and it's not there yet because we're still living in this current pandemic, which is the COVID pandemic, right, is mental health.
Yep.
Mental health will be the next pandemic.
I completely agree.
And how are we going to navigate a huge influx of individual needing services, right? And when we think about services, our communities are not going to care about county lines.
Nope.
They're not going to care about whether they have insurance or not, or what insurance is on. What they care about is, can you help me? Can you speak my language? Do you look like me? Do you understand me? Right? And we have to be ready to basically answer their call.
Yeah. And I'll give a perfect example, right? So in San Francisco, I was around, I used to take the bus downtown. That was my public transportation. That's how I got around. And over the years, I seen more homeless, more drug abuse, more, stepping over basically a dead body, right? And what shifted for San Francisco was, hey, we have more homeless services now. We can help people who are homeless. I remember talking to individuals from Texas, from Seattle, from, China, from Japan, right? So that was a homeless pandemic. So the next one, and I completely agree with you, because I would say my generation right now, what we're going through is how to not only combat the systemics of or the stigma of what mental health awareness is, but then also, how do we get that? How do we receive services? And I'm blessed and fortunate enough to live in a very innovative area that, I can receive services pretty much from my cell phone, right? But if you have individuals, say, from Texas, and I don't know what services they have out there, but I'm assuming, and this is my assumptions, what services they have out there may not work for the individual who live out there. So for them to call KCCEB, how do you evolve that? How do you continue to give people services, and specifically mental health services, but if they're not in your county?
Exactly. And we have to think about, we have affordable healthcare, right? And we are pushing to have universal healthcare. That's the drive. That's the goal. Mental health care is the same thing. We need to have universal mental health services. That is without barriers, without borders. And the important part is it's about them. It's about you. If you want services, doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter what language you speak, you will get the services. And that's how you reduce barriers. And that's how you also reduce stigma. Because sometimes when you think about stigma it's hard for some community members. They have multiple battles. One is stigma. When they finally have the courage to call, and the first thing they said is, well, no, we don't speak that language. Sorry. They get turned away.
That's an immediate shutdown.
That's an immediate shutdown because they took all this courage for them to finally, fought, whether it's taboo, saving face, all of that thing, even their family to get these services and to realize these services aren't available, whether it's in their culture, in their language. And that's huge. And so I think that one of the vision that we hope to continue to expand is like, how do we provide mental health services without barriers? And when we talk about without barriers, it's language barrier, it's border barrier, it's countywide barriers, all of those barriers that, financial, all of it. And I think that we have to look at what funding stream, even the county need to shift or the state needs to shift when it comes to providing mental health services. The beautiful thing about California is we're so innovative.
Yeah.
Right? We are innovative. We are community driven, right? And I think that this is where this needs to be heard. Like if we could be the first universal healthcare state, and it could be the first universal mental health care state. And I think that's really important in order to be able to reduce disparity, in order to push for equity, in order to really get our communities to come out and feel like they can get support without worrying, how am I going to pay for this? Do I need to have insurance?
And
With this county, right?
And I do want to add, right? We, as a country, as the world, we have evolved a digital era, right? So who's to say a funding stream opens and in order to tackle the border barrier, the financial barrier, what if this is me speaking out loud here. What if a counselor can hop on a Zoom free of charge to talk to someone in their language, and it's like just one-on-one counseling, like just as something as simple as one-on-one counseling, right? Or one-on-one check-ins. If that can happen throughout pretty much, I would say probably this state at first, start with the state, or really start with the county. We start with the county, then go statewide. I feel like we would be the innovators to universal mental health care.
Exactly. And the resources would make a huge difference. And we can see how the virtual world has opened a lot of communities to actually seek and reach out for mental health services. So, and on top of that, we also, at KCCEBs, we know that there's not enough, right? Bilingual, bicultural mental health professionals, especially in community mental health setting. Many times it's the private sector that goes. They would basically provide services in the private sector. But not everyone has the privilege to be able to access mental health where they can pay out of pocket or have insurance that's equitable enough to cover mental health services. So we also want to grow our mental health agent pipeline. It's pretty much a training hub for community mental health providers who are bilingual, bicultural, and to really grow where they can actually, stay in the community and to provide mental health service in the community where we can have enough in order to meet the needs of this huge influx of community members who are going to need these services, right? It's great that we have all the resources, but I think when it comes to digital and technology, but we need to share them.
Yeah, and they need to be free for individuals who can't access them.
And we also need the funding in order to support the community, right? We need enough, professional to really do that. Yeah. There's a need. The needs are coming, and it's going to grow greater. Yeah. But we don't have enough resources for our community. We're stuck again. And we can't do that. We know the needs now, and we need to really be able to really address it.
Well, thank you so much, Kcc, for sharing aloud everything you had to say, for sharing your story, and for sharing all of the amazing work KCCEB has done.
I think where we want to see ourselves grow, that we already sort of got started pivoting and getting our feet wet, is advocacy is still part of our mission.
Mhm.
And I think from our perspective, like our clients' perspective, what they see the most is our services. So a lot of times, because services is where we started with, we always have to remind ourselves to like, hey, resource development, advocacy, education is part of our mission too, and we should hold ourselves accountable to that. And advocacy is one of the things because community empowerment is our goal. So advocacy has to be naturally part of our goal too. And there's so many different models of advocacy. There's already organizations that are doing just great work in in policy advocacy and community mobilizing. And our question is like, where do we fit in? Where can we contribute? Not reinventing the wheel and not doing something that other folks are already doing, but where can we fill our our strengths in and gap that we can fill in? And I think part of that is storytelling, because a lot of our work is direct services and we have that direct contact with our community members. Is how do we collect their voice and then uplift it so that it's their story telling the narratives about the issues that they're facing. And I think that we're in a very special role that we're able to do that. Whether it's about, we had a story collection about our mental health client who just talked about her journey, being an immigrant with her immigrant family and her journey through healing. Very powerful. And also, like, we had youth develop a story about just what it is feeling like growing up as Asian kids in this country, with the family dynamics. We also did tobacco cessation work. And even though we had a separate cessation program that we're running, we're hearing so many stories from the community members. We're like, wow, we never thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's just as minor as I don't use nicotine gum because all the instructions are in English. And we never thought about that. So it's just like those little things, even we're like, okay, we really want people to hear about this. Decision makers, stakeholders, funders, they need to hear these stories and then start rethinking about and reframing the program they're running today, or what's being funded today, or how they're being implemented today. So we think that it's our job. That's like our advocacy piece, is story collection and then story sharing. So that's where we see, I would say, in the very, very, very long run in the future, because I know you asked about 5-10 years, I think down to 50 years down the line.
Oh, 50. All right, cool.
I always, I think we all kind of joked about this, is we do want to work ourselves out of the job, as in we want to be in a place where KCCEB or organizations like KCCEB is no longer needed. I think that's when we could say, man, we really did our job.
Mm-hmm.
Where our community is empowered, that they could raise voice, they could lead the change, and they don't need organizations like us, or there's no inequity, or at least to the most part, that organizations like us filling in that gap or bridging that gap is no longer needed. So
you're able to change that generational gap, as you were saying, and have this community you guys serve be able to not only voice their opinions, but to voice them to the right people and be able to be self-sustainable on their own.
Exactly. And to know that
You
what
said
they
that
have
beautifully.
it's their rights, right? This is my right.
Yeah.
This is my human right.
No, I'm entitled. Right? I am entitled to this.
Exactly.
that's what we're trying to teach our clients to be.
Yeah.
Don't feel like don't feel like you're apologetic. There's no reason to be apologetic about the help you're getting.
You literally, as a human being, have a human right to all of this, not only in your language, but also to all the affordable, things that we can give you, or that this world can offer you.
Exactly. And I think the message is mental health is a right. It's a human right.
Yeah,
it's not
absolutely.
a privilege.
That
It's
is
a
a
human
basic
right.
need.
It's a basic need. Like healthcare is a human right. Mental health should be a human right as well.
'Cause they
And
go
that's
hand in
really our
hand.
drive.
Yeah, they go hand in hand. If I break my leg, right? If I break my leg and now I have PTSD from bunk beds, right? And this is a real story. I jumped off my bunk bed and I snapped my fibia and tibia in two, right? So you don't have to put this in the podcast. I'm just telling the story. But essentially, I jumped off my bunk bed and I ended up getting PTSD from heights. And I've overcame it, but when I was younger, instantly there, right? But again, hand in hand, healthcare mental health care.
When we talk about wellness, it's holistic, right? And I
Yeah.
think with KCCEB, this is what we are. We are trying to create a holistic hub. You can't address mental health without addressing the other needs.
Yep.
That's the
Exactly.
thing. So that's why we want to create our dream, our goal is to be a one-stop shop center, to be holistic. And when we think about holistic, it's not just holistic services, it's holistic healing, right? How do you work on that? You work on healing the mind, the body, and the heart,
Yeah.
by providing all of these safety nets and empowering our community members
Yep.
to have a voice, to raise their voice, and to use that voice. And that's what's powerful about this.
Now, that's all the questions I have for today. Thank you so much, Yuri. Thank you so much, Lisa,
Thank you.
for coming
Thank
on the
you.
podcast and sharing everything, not only your personal stories, which were amazing, but also the work you do, which is as well amazing. And, I'd like to thank our viewers at home or wherever you guys are at for viewing in and just, taking a peek at what HHREC has going on with the community partners here in Alameda County. And I'd like to thank the Korean Community Center of the East Bay for joining in. And with that being said, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. And